Marcus Bellamy was 39 years old the night his wife sent him the text that ended their marriage, though she would not realize what she had done for another 6 hours. He was sitting in the cab of his work truck outside a closed-down warehouse on the east side of Charlotte, North Carolina, finishing a thermos of coffee his grandmother had taught him to brew strong enough to wake the dead and bother the living. The phone on the dashboard buzzed once. He glanced at it, expecting one of the foremen, expecting a question about the morning schedule. Instead, he saw his wife Adrienne's name, and beneath it a message that was not meant for him. He's gone again. Site visit until Friday. Come over around 9. Bring the wine you like. I'll wear the black thing. There was a smile emoji at the end. Then a heart. Marcus read it twice. He did not move. He did not blink fast, or grip the steering wheel, or feel the inside of his chest collapse the way men in movies do. He simply finished his coffee. He screwed the cap back onto the thermos. He took a photograph of the screen with his second phone, the older one nobody knew about, and he put both phones down and watched the dashboard clock turn from 7:14 to 7:15. To anyone passing by, he was just a man in a Carhartt jacket, sitting in a Ford F-250 at the end of a long day. To anyone who knew what he was actually looking at, he was the quietest storm Mecklenburg County had ever seen. Adrienne thought she had married a project supervisor who worked 60 hours a week and drove a truck older than their marriage. She thought their joint account held $900 and that the house was mortgaged to the studs. She thought she had been very careful. She had been planning her exit for 16 months. What Adrienne never thought to ask, not once in 11 years of marriage, was why a man who built things for a living had insisted on keeping every single deed, every single signature, every single piece of paper in a fireproof safe at his uncle's law office on Tryon Street. She also did not know that the man she had been sleeping with for 9 of those 16 months had once worked for Marcus and had been fired, and had never figured out who his old boss actually was. The black thing. The wine he liked. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second, and then opened them. $217,000 had moved through their accounts in the last 14 months. In patterns, he had been watching the way an engineer watches a hairline crack widen. She had no idea North Carolina law would let him take back every last dollar, and a great deal more besides. What happened next would cost Adrienne everything she thought she had stolen, and the man she was about to host would learn, 23 days later, exactly whose wine he had been drinking. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light filtered through the kitchen Marcus had renovated with his own hands 3 winters earlier, catching the edge of the butcher block counter he had cut and oiled himself. The coffee was already brewing. He stood at the window in a worn flannel shirt and watched a pair of cardinals work the feeder he had built from cedar scraps left over from a porch job in Mooresville. The house was quiet. Adrienne was still upstairs. The dog they had inherited from his late aunt slept in a square of sunlight near the back door. Marcus poured his coffee black into a heavy ceramic mug his grandmother had given him at his college graduation. The mug had a chip on the rim from the day he had brought it home from his deployment in 2008. He never replaced it. His grandmother had said something to him the morning he left for the Army, sitting at her own kitchen table with her Bible open and her hands folded over it, and the words had stayed with him the way certain hymns do. Boy, she had said, tools were meant to work, not shine. The good ones are the ones that don't draw attention. She had been dead now for 4 years. He still heard her some mornings. Marcus Bellamy did not look like a wealthy man, and that was by design. He owned a regional construction and logistics firm called Bellamy Holdings, headquartered in a low brick building off Independence Boulevard, with contracts running through 3 states, and a payroll of 82 people. He had inherited the seed money from his grandmother's life insurance and a small piece of family land in Lancaster County, South Carolina, sold at the right time to the right buyer. He had grown it quietly. Only his Uncle Reggie, who was also his attorney, and his financial advisor Patricia Vance, knew the full size of what he had built. Adrian believed he was a supervisor for a company he himself owned 3 times over. He had let her believe it. Some lessons, his grandmother used to say, were only learned by the people who taught themselves. He had met her at a county fair 11 years earlier. In the summer, he came home from his second tour. She had been selling raffle tickets for a women's shelter, and she had laughed at something he said about the dunk tank, and that laugh had walked him straight into a year of courtship. She had been kind then. She had brought soup to his uncle when his uncle had pneumonia. She had cried when Marcus's grandmother died. He still believed those tears had been real. Whatever she became later, she had not been that woman in the beginning, and that knowledge was its own quiet grief. He carried his coffee to the small office at the back of the house, the one with the desk he had built from a single slab of walnut, salvaged from a storm-fallen tree in Gaston County. On the desk sat his work laptop, a notebook full of job site sketches, and a small leather folder Patricia had given him 3 months earlier. He had not opened that folder in weeks. He opened it now. Inside were the printouts he had started keeping when the first thing had gone wrong. The first thing he had noticed without knowing what it was. 8 months earlier, Adrienne had withdrawn $3,000 in cash from their joint account and told him it was for a girls' weekend in Asheville. There had been no girls' weekend. He had not asked. He had simply written it down. Above the desk, mounted to the wall in a simple black frame, was a doorbell camera receipt from the system he had installed himself the previous fall. The one with the second hidden lens above the garage that pointed not at the porch, but at the driveway. Adrienne did not know about that camera. Almost no one did. She kissed his cheek that morning when she came downstairs in her robe, smelling of a perfume he had not bought her, and asked him what time he would be home. He told her late. She smiled and said she might go to bed early. He smiled back and said that was probably a good idea. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was the unknown number, the same one that had been calling since Tuesday, the one he had not yet answered. He let it ring through. He worked until 6:30 that evening, parked outside the warehouse on East 36th Street, and that was when the text came in. The black thing, the wine he liked, the smile, the heart. Marcus drove home that night, with both hands steady on the wheel and the radio off. He pulled into the driveway at 9:47 and saw what he expected to see. Adrienne's car gone from the garage, a note on the kitchen counter saying she had run to her sister's, the dog still asleep by the back door. He walked to his office. He opened the doorbell camera app on the second phone. He scrolled back to 8:52 p.m. The footage was clear. A silver Audi Q5 had pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out, late 30s, lean, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a bottle of wine and a small paper bag. He looked around once, easily, as if he had done this before. He walked up the steps Marcus had rebuilt with his own hands the previous spring and let himself in with a key Marcus had not given him. The timestamp showed 8:53 p.m. The next clip showed Adrienne's car returning at 9:11. She had not gone to her sister's. She had only gone to pick up the wine he liked, because the wine he liked was apparently not what was in their house. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He pulled the laptop closer. He opened a folder he had created 6 months earlier and never told anyone about. He titled it simply, Adrienne. Inside, he began to deposit screenshots, bank exports, vendor invoices that did not match any contractor he had hired, hotel charges in Greensboro and Asheville and Wilmington, a $4,200 charge at a jewelry store in South Park Mall, on a piece he had never seen her wear. The pattern that emerged was not a fling. It was an infrastructure. $217,000 across 14 months, moved in increments small enough to look ordinary, applied against a future life she had been preparing for a man she thought Marcus did not know. But Marcus knew him. The license plate on the silver Audi belonged to a Dean Whitaker, age 38, of Cornelius, North Carolina. 3 years earlier, Dean Whitaker had been a junior project manager at Bellamy Holdings for 9 months before Marcus had personally signed the paperwork terminating him for falsifying mileage reimbursements and fabricating a subcontractor invoice in the amount of $6,400. Dean had never known whose company he had stolen from. He had only known his supervisor on the floor, and the floor supervisor's boss, and the boss's boss who had signed his exit letter from somewhere in Atlanta. He had never met the man who actually owned the place. He still did not know. 16 months ago, he had met Marcus's wife at a charity event Marcus had not attended. He had told her he was an independent investor. He had told her a great many things. Marcus closed the laptop. He picked up the phone, the older one. He made a single phone call. "Uncle Reggie," he said softly, "go ahead and bring it around. All of it. We start Monday morning." 3 days passed. By Monday, Marcus was sitting across from his Uncle Reggie Bellamy in a corner office on Tryon Street, the morning light cutting hard across stacks of folders that Patricia Vance had spent the weekend assembling. Reggie was 67 years old, a former public defender turned estate attorney, with white at his temples and a habit of cleaning his glasses on his tie when he was thinking. He had been the first one to tell Marcus, 20 years earlier, that a man's signature was the most powerful tool in his toolbox. Reggie did not flinch as he read through the evidence. He looked up only once, at the end, and said, "You did the work, son. That's the only thing that matters in a room like the one you're about to be in. Preparation is the work." Patricia had already begun the asset wall. North Carolina was an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, and Patricia had spent years insulating Marcus's holdings inside a series of trusts, LLCs, and operating agreements that predated the marriage. Adrienne was not on a single one of those entities. She had signed a postnup 6 years earlier, a document Reggie had drafted in such plain language that any judge would honor it, and she had signed it on the morning of a beach vacation she had been excited about, paying it almost no attention. The postnup protected Bellamy Holdings entirely. It also contained a fidelity clause she had probably forgotten existed. Patricia tapped the relevant page with the end of her pen. "She will lose access to spousal support entirely under this clause," she said. "I will lose no sleep over it." Reggie's investigator, a quiet man named Ellis Moore, who had been a Charlotte Mecklenburg detective for 22 years before he retired, was already pulling the parallel file on Dean Whitaker. Within a week, Ellis had built a profile that read like a forensic accountant's nightmare. Dean had been fired from 2 more companies after Bellamy Holdings, each time for variations on the same theme: small embezzlements, padded expense reports, fabricated invoices. He had defaulted on a small business loan in Mooresville. He had a civil judgment against him from a former girlfriend in Raleigh for $31,000 in unpaid rent and loans. The Audi was leased in someone else's name, an aunt in Concord, who likely did not know her credit was being used. Dean Whitaker was not an investor. Dean Whitaker was a man 2 months away from the Ayers catching up with him. He had been treating Adrienne the way he had treated 3 women before her, as a temporary funding source dressed up in romance. That Wednesday, Marcus drove out to Lancaster County to see his great-aunt Mabel, the last of his grandmother's 3 sisters, 84 years old, and still keeping bees in a row of white boxes behind her brick ranch house. She poured him sweet tea and sat across from him at her kitchen table and listened to the whole story without interrupting. When he was done, she folded her hands and said, "Baby, Your grandmother used to say bitterness was a tax on your own future. Don't pay it. Just hand the woman the bill that's already hers and walk out of the building. She reached across the table and patted his hand. Real power operates in quiet rooms, son. You already know that. Now go on and do it the way she taught you. He drove back to Charlotte through the long flat farmland and the falling light, and he thought about his grandmother, and he thought about how his life had been a series of quiet rooms, and he thought about how Adrian was about to find out how many of them there were. By the end of the second week, Patricia had frozen the joint accounts and quietly moved the residual balances into a separate operating account that Adrian could not touch. Reggie had filed under seal. Ellis had documented Adrian's overnight visits to a short-term rental in Cornelius, the one Dean Whitaker had been splitting with another woman, whose name and address were now also part of the file. Marcus, every evening, came home and ate dinner with his wife, as if nothing had happened. She made his plate. She asked about his day. He answered with the calm of a man checking off the last items on a list. She kissed his cheek on Friday morning and told him she loved him, and he said, "I know," and she did not catch the weight in it, because she had stopped paying attention to him a long time ago. Some things you don't say. You simply prepare to show. The reckoning was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the conference room on the 14th floor of Reggie's building. Patricia had asked Adrian to come in to review some joint financial documents related to the next tax year. Adrian had agreed without suspicion. She had even worn the gray suit she wore to her own attorney's office. She arrived at 10:00 a.m. with a small leather portfolio and the careful smile of a woman who believed she was managing a situation. She did not know her own divorce attorney had been notified the previous Friday. She did not know Dean Whitaker had received a certified letter that same morning from the Ayers, the result of a quiet, perfectly legal tip Ellis had routed through the proper channels 3 weeks earlier. She walked into the conference room and stopped. Reggie was already seated at the head of the long walnut table. Patricia sat to his right. To Patricia's right sat Adrian's own mother, Lorraine, 63, retired schoolteacher, who had driven up from Rock Hill that morning at Marcus's quiet request, and who had not been told why until she arrived. Beside Lorraine sat Aunt Mabel, in her Sunday coat, her cane resting against the table leg. At the far end sat Marcus, in a dark suit Adrian had never seen him wear, with a folder in front of him and a glass of water beside it. There was one empty chair. It was for Adrian. She sat down slowly. "Mrs. Bellamy," Patricia said, "thank you for coming. We have a series of documents to review with you this morning. We thought it would be useful for your mother to be present." The document drop took exactly 14 minutes. Patricia laid out, one by one, the printed bank exports, the screenshot of the misdirected text, the hotel receipts, the jewelry charge, the wire transfers Adrian had set up using a forged version of Marcus's signature on a notarized form she had assumed he would never see. Patricia laid out the postnup, open to the fidelity clause, with Adrian's own signature in blue ink at the bottom. She laid out the file on Dean Whitaker, the prior fraud, the civil judgment, the parallel girlfriend in Cornelius, the Ayers letter dated the previous Friday. Adrian's face went through the stages Reggie had told Marcus to watch for: confidence, confusion, the first edge of fear, the collapse beneath the fear. Her mother did not look at her once. Then Reggie spoke. "Adrian, I think there is something you do not know about your husband. Marcus is not a project supervisor. He has not been a project supervisor for 9 years. Marcus is the sole owner of Bellamy Holdings, a regional firm with operations in 3 states, current valuation in the high 8 figures. He is also, as you may now recall, the man who personally signed the termination paperwork on a certain Dean Whitaker in 2022 for embezzlement. Mr. Whitaker did not know whose wife he was sleeping with. Mr. Whitaker does not know whose money he has been spending. He is about to learn both. Adrienne opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Marcus," she said, "there's an explanation. We can talk about this. We don't need lawyers. We don't need—" Adrienne, her mother's voice cut across the room like a switch. "Be quiet. You have done enough today. You will sit there, and you will listen to what these people have built, because what they have built is the truth. And the truth is the only thing in this room you have not already destroyed." Adrienne began to cry. It was not the first kind of crying. It was the second kind, the kind that is for an audience. Marcus stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at his wife, for what would be the last time in any room that mattered. "Adrienne," he said quietly, "I built a life with my own hands. I built it before you, and I built it during you, and I will keep building it after you. You decided I was a man who would not notice. You picked the wrong man to build against. I know how to build things that last, and I know how to take down things that were never built right in the first place. The papers will tell you the rest. My uncle will see you out." He picked up his folder. He walked around the table. He paused only once, to put a hand on Aunt Mabel's shoulder. Then he walked out of the room. He did not look back. Behind him, the door closed on a silence that would last in Adrienne's memory for the rest of her life. 8 months had passed like water. Marcus stood on the back porch of a small farmhouse outside Waxhaw he had bought in cash that spring, coffee in one hand, the morning settling over a half-acre of garden he had laid out himself. The tomato plants were leaning under their own weight, splitting at the seams the way his grandmothers used to. He had planted a Japanese maple by the back steps in her memory. He had built a workbench in the detached garage from cedar he had milled on a friend's property in Union County. The dog from the old house was asleep in the grass, older now, grayer at the muzzle, but content. Bellamy Holdings had closed on a $41 million logistics contract with a hospital network in the spring. He had used part of the proceeds to start a small foundation in his grandmother's name, providing trade scholarships to young men aging out of the Mecklenburg County foster system. 23 students had been placed so far. He attended every graduation he could. He had met Celeste Hargrove at a foundation dinner that fall. She was 41, a pediatric oncology nurse from Concord, the kind of woman who asked good questions and did not perform for anybody. She had a daughter in college. She had laughed once at something Marcus said about the centerpiece arrangement, and that laugh had been familiar to him in a way he had stopped expecting laughter to be. They had taken it slowly. She came out to the farmhouse on Sundays now. She helped him in the garden. She did not need to know what he had been before he met her, but she knew, and she had simply nodded, and she had asked him what he wanted to build next. Adrienne lived in a small apartment in East Charlotte. The settlement had stripped her of any claim to Bellamy Holdings, of spousal support, of the house and the cars and the joint accounts. She had been ordered to repay the wired funds in full. She worked the front desk at a chiropractor's office off Albemarle Road. Her mother had not spoken to her in 7 months. Her sister had asked her to stop calling. Dean Whitaker had pled out on the federal tax case in March and was serving 32 months at a low-security facility in Butner. The Audi had been repossessed before the trial even started. Marcus heard about all of it through Ellis Moore, who still came by every few months for coffee. He registered each piece of news the way a man notes weather he is no longer standing in. Then he moved on. That morning he set his coffee down on the porch rail and walked out to the garden. Celeste was due at noon. Aunt Mabel was coming the next weekend. He knelt in the soft earth between the rows and pressed a small basil seedling into the ground with the same care his grandmother had once shown him in her own backyard 50 years before. The Cardinals were back at the feeder. The morning was clean. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.